Yeah. What was your first memory of being online?
First memory of being online is essentially I didn't really know how to use the internet at really young ages. I had my parents do it. There was there was something though that I guess was my purest introduction to the internet was this disc that was like a promo thing for Son of the Mask, and it
Mm-hmm.
had like Sato websites. That it was like a program that was on a disc, and you put it in your at that time it was Windows XP.
Uh-huh.
You put it in the player, and you're given these like movie themed websites. Because I used to love that movie when I was like, I don't know, 3 or 4 or some shit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was kind of my first introduction to websites.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, obviously it wasn't purely online. I don't think it might have been, but yeah, and it even had its own like Sato web browser and yeah. So that's like my first experience, the earliest memory, and then my other earliest memory is when on YouTube back in the Wild West days of YouTube.
Uh-huh.
You used to be able to find all of these like clip compilations of shit. So
Mm-hmm.
at that time, I was really in. I still am to an extent, quite a bit, but I was always into the slashers, right?
Yeah, right.
Freddy, Jason. Actually, not as much Jason back then, but like especially Chucky though. Chucky was my favorite at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And, they used to make all these videos where it was a kill compilation and they'd put on some, like, badass metal song in the background. So there was one that I vividly remember where it was a Chucky kill compilation with Rammstein's Sonny in the back.
Uh-huh.
Which actually introduced me to one of my favorite metal songs of all time. But that is something that I distinctly remember. And it's really crazy to think about the internet back then and YouTube
Yep.
in general, because at that time you also had the royalty-free music library that they would
Mm-hmm.
offer.
Mm-hmm.
Had like 009 sound system and like a few Breaking Benjamin songs, I think.
Yeah.
And then Finger 11's Paralyzer and shit like that. So I remember just digging through YouTube just obsessively and just seeing all of these videos. It was a wild time. So those are like my earliest, most vivid memories of using the internet.
Yeah, no. That's funny. Yeah, I mean that's interesting that you mentioned the like music video thing, because I think, I remember just personally, like, when I was younger, I was really into the Clone Wars, and this was a little bit after, this was in like 2011, 2012, but like I was really into the Clone Wars, the Star Wars animated show. And there were these like videos online called like they were like music videos for like they would do like music videos for different characters. So there was like different villains would have like a different song. And I remember the two songs that I remember very clearly were were The Prodigy,
Hell yeah.
Invaders Must Die, and
Yup.
then and then it also introduced me to fucking Hollywood Undead and Lump Your Head. And I was like, wow, this is like the coolest thing ever. So yeah, I think it is interesting how much like music, like how this kind of, I guess not The Prodigy, but like the other stuff we mentioned, this pretty mediocre music was so like big and ubiquitous, and it's interesting to see like how that kind of took over YouTube. I don't know.
What I'm interested in too is that I think that the times that I'm talking about with the royalty-free music and the the finding Chucky kill compilations.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at least, I mean, those are still made now, but they're, like, much more professional.
Right.
And usually they have a narrator over it, and they're like, this is how many people Jason kills, and Jason takes Manhattan, or whatever. But back then, it used to be, like, the most primitive Windows movie maker. Like, but I'm thinking about this, though, and it just kind of dawned, it just kind of came to me, is that I I kind of noticed the shift. A lot of those videos were removed, I think, around the time when Google bought YouTube, number one, and number two, when Vevo came in.
Wait, what's Vevo?
Vevo, VEVO is basically all major label artists have a Vevo page.
Oh.
That has like all of their music videos. So I think that the rights to major songs, whatever, Metallica, Rammstein, they're all under this branch, and they kind of had a stranglehold on YouTube music distribution. So I think that those two factors are definitely a reason why you're not really able to find, videos that are slideshows with Finger Eleven's Paralyzer or whatever.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I think, I also remember, trying to find these videos. Some of them are still up, but, a lot of them got copyright striked. And that was a big thing because, even up until, 2015 or so, I feel like copyright on YouTube was so much more lenient and sort of flexible. People, I think I remember in 2015, 2016, that's when people really started to get copyright striked constantly. And then of course there was the adpocalypse or whatever the fuck they wanted to call it.
You know what? Something even before that, to be honest, that era was more about video content. That was more about movie reviewers and
right.
Whatever. But before that, the main controversy was song clips. There was a story, or back in 2009, when this woman used a video, or took a video of her baby dancing to a Prince song. I think it was So Crazy. And there was this huge... It was basically the earlier version of the adpocalypse, quote unquote, or whatever, where there was court cases over this shit.
Right.
The whole thing with because Viacom was the big bad evil company at that time. So this has been going on for a while, but I think that YouTube was already getting a bunch of threats over they were getting threatened to be sued up the ass over music usage. When Google came in and bought it, they really, really tightened up because they didn't want to fuck anything up with being sued like that, especially after the whole Prince thing. That was resolved out of court in 6 years later. It's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. No, totally, and it ties in especially with stuff we've talked about before with regards to YouTube YouTube poops and how they tie in with with sample culture and how that really got shut down with the Beastie Boys. Yeah.
Culture jamming, yeah.
Right, yeah.
And then, obviously at that time, John Oswald, Negative Land. And, there's an argument that I've made that, with De La and with Beasties, that was much more a deliberate art. That was meant to be art, period. With Negative Land and with YouTube Poops, I think they're kind of one and the same because the collage style was very much kind of a reflection of alienation and humor. Very blatant humor. So yeah, there's definitely that connection too. I've always kind of said that Negative Land was a direct pipeline to YouTube Poops.
Right.
That weird early mid 90s internet sites that were just total abstract.
Right. Yeah.
Hit posts you could say.
Of course.
The hamster dance site, and then the You're the Man Now dog.
Yep.
All that stuff. That is definitely also another crucial building block to YouTube Poops. Also the Something Awful forums. I mean, there's so much stuff.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and it's a very clear through line for a lot of these this movement or these movements, I guess. But
yeah.
I wanted to ask you, I guess, since we're talking about music, how did so first of all, why don't you explain a little bit about your current musical interests, and kind of explain what got you to that point. Like talk about, like sort of how your musical interest developed into what it is today, I guess.
Oh, okay. I mean, so I'll just get this out of the way. I'll explain my instrumentation currently.
Mm-hmm.
I play a lot of different types of music, mostly with friends, and it's not stuff that I want to record, but my main passion is contemporary improvisation, primarily on percussion and electronics. And I also do play instruments like saxophone, guitar, just recently upright bass,
Mm-hmm.
trumpet. There's other ones I can mention, but for all the instruments that I play, I try to play them percussively, so that they function and fit within the improvisation language in terms of like texture and form. So that's what I do currently. Now, I guess to give a short story of where I'm at, I started out with, when I was younger, my first real introduction to music, except for just pop music, was like grunge music, was Nirvana, it was
Mm-hmm.
Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, very, very little Sonic Youth, maybe like one or two songs.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like my pure introduction to kind of just taking music more seriously. And then, later on, I started, looking on the internet and reading the, like, Rolling Stone, top albums of all time.
Right.
And then afterwards, I kind of took a break from music, because that was, at the time I was playing drums for a few years, and then I just kind of dropped it, and then I got more into film for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and I stopped playing drums for, like, 2 years, I think. And then around 2014, late 2014, and this is a bit embarrassing, but I started like looking into Pitchfork,
Mm-hmm.
and this is pre-Conde,
Mm-hmm.
and then fucking like Fantano and shit like that.
Yep.
And I just started, Radiohead's Kid A and Godspeed Black Emperor, and like all these like canon albums were discovered by me.
Mm-hmm.
At time, right in like middle school, and then later on, things just kind of went from there. And then in like 8th grade, I started getting into White House and Merzbow, and I started hearing. Then I started hearing the late era Coltrane records, Ascension and Meditations, and then Ornette Coleman, and it just kept going until at a certain point in freshman year, I was listening to A&M.
Mm-hmm.
And, and my whole musical trajectory changed, because I always wanted to be in, like, a freaky experimental rock band. That was, like, my main goal.
Right.
For a while. And then I just kind of realized there's really no use. I'm not somebody that likes writing songs. I don't like being a composer.
Mm-hmm.
It just was about me. I always like playing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I'm much more interested in playing as a concept.
Mm-hmm.
So and then it went from there, and then I met my mentor, which is a long story of how that happened, Matt Weston, and a student of Bill Dixon, Milford Graves, and Arthur Brooks,
Mm-hmm.
who went to Bennington, where I currently go
Mm-hmm.
to right now, college. That's kind of that was like when everything locked into place 100%. And I guess currently my main collaborators are Matt Weston and my best friend Colin Ainsworth,
Yep.
who I introduced to the music.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a bit for him to fully latch into it, but now he's a total head.
Yep.
So I guess that's and you had like a second question there too.
I was gonna. Yeah, I think it was all kind of tied. I think you nicely pretty much answered the whole question. But yeah, no, it's interesting. It's interesting how, I guess, relatively early you got into like I guess what they would call mucore, right? Because I didn't get into that until I was like 15, you know, and it was like, yeah, I mean, it is interesting though. Yeah, and I guess you would have been around for also like Death Grips in their final, not final, but like during Jenny Death and I guess that era. Well, because Jenny Death came out in what, like March, wasn't it like early 2015 or?
2015.
Yeah, so I guess you would have been around for that. Yeah, and it's again, it's interesting how, again, that ties in with, you know, the internet. And I think the internet, you know, has definitely, you know, sort of, as you said, introduced a lot of people to this kind of music that otherwise they might not have been introduced to. Like, even like, you know, quote unquote, like avant teen culture, right? Like,
It's not real.
No, I know, but like, that's even a good example though of like, you know, that the fact that these subcultures can exist online, you know, in because of the internet largely.
Yeah.
So I guess actually I'll ask.
You know what? I forgot to mention something else.
Oh yeah,
too.
go ahead.
For music that I make, I can't believe I forgot this. That's my, you know, contemporary improvisation is my main thing, but also noise culture is a big part of my life too.
Mm-hmm.
It has been. It actually was in my life earlier than becoming an improviser. So I would say that my noise projects are slightly more of a hobby than my main focus, but you know, I'm very much a total dork for noise and noise culture and noise history.
Mm-hmm.
I had to mention that because that's definitely an important factor, and it also kind of informs what I do primarily.
Yeah, of course. And again, that's just, you know, again, yeah, like noise music becoming more popular. I think, you know, even, you know, you can even see it with like millennials who, you know, like people like 100 Tricks Point Never and like James Ferraro, who came out of this, you know, noise background that they might not have come out of if they were born, you know, 10 years earlier even, right? And I think the internet really helped popularize a lot of, or, you know, it helped spread it, because I guess before that, you know, as we've talked about before, like, you know, I guess before that, if you wanted to get really into noise, you had like Banana Fish, which was, of course, a huge inspiration for, you know, this magazine. But, you know, other than Banana Fish and like stuff like that, I guess you had like what? It was very niche. You kind of had to like, you know, really be introduced to someone, and you still do to some extent, but it's like less, you know, contained. And I guess, oh yeah, go ahead.
So basically back then in the 90s, from what I know from people that lived through it,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to talk about both sections of music here, but first I'll start out with noise and how people found out about it. So yes, Banana Fish, huge example. But there was also, obviously, Merzbow's releases on Relapse, which Relapse was primarily a death metal label.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a teenager in the 90s, and I mean, again, Relapse CDs used to be sold at like Borders bookstores, and like Barnes.
Really? So, wow. Okay.
So a lot of times, these kids that were looking for death metal in like the Relapse section would come across this crazy, you know, Merzbow record with a blue skull on the front,
right?
And it's the sticker says the most extreme thing, and they're like, oh, this is on Relapse, I want this. And then they come home and it completely changed their life.
Yep.
And then, you know, obviously the other examples too is that sometimes there was just one person that had an RRR catalog, that Ron's catalog of shit, and the friend would go, dude, this is crazy stuff. Like, I don't know where this is coming from. This is nuts. And then finally, the other big thing that I guess introduced a lot of kids to noise back in the 90s was, of course, Thurston Moore and Sonic Youth.
Right.
Name dropping noise groups in interviews, and you know, Thurston wearing, you know, T-shirts of like Violent Onsen Geisha and like all that stuff. And so you know, the Masana and MTV is the infamous one, but those were the main ways that people found it. And now for contemporary improvisation, there was even, again, I could mention Thurston, you know, having people open up for him and, mentioning Derek Bailey a lot. And then also the main thing really that introduced people back then is that you had to go to the right universities. That was it. That is when you got introduced to it. If you wanted to choose the class that said something like, something to the extent of like black music of the 1960s.
Right.
You go and then you learn about this whole thing, and then people went from there.
Yeah.
But that takes a lot more time, and it takes a lot more dedication, going shop to shop to try to find an Incas catalog.
Mm-hmm.
Like, now it's just like you could type in crazy improvised music, and then you get whatever, you get like EAI or whatever.
Right, yeah. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, and I think, oh, hang on. Okay. Yeah, I think, like, as we've discussed before, I think there are both downsides and upsides to, to having this freely, super open, cultural access, basically. I think, obviously the upsides are, like we've already talked about, but the downsides, it does kind of diminish the uniqueness or, like, the special, the specialness of some of these works of art, right? So, yeah, I mean, are you still there?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, what is that? Okay. Yeah, I think it's complicated, but I think what I was going to ask as the final question is, and this is obviously a big one, but obviously I think, the new music or improvised music has not maybe taken off as much as noise has, which of course you mentioned as your second, big interest at the moment with music. So, I mean, obviously the new music was extremely popular in, like, the 60s. Do you think that there's, like, do you think that in the near future, so, like, 10, 20 years, latest, do you think that there's any, like, what do you see as the future of improvised music? Do you think that there'll be, like, a resurgence of interest in it like there was in the 60s among, like, younger people, or do you think it will kind of stay where it is right now?
So it's a very hard thing to answer, but I think that generally, I don't think that it will have the reach that noise has, because there is, and I hate to say this, but for most of it, there is a barrier to entry. And what I mean by that is that, 99% of the time, if you kind of have to be a traditionally trained musician before you start playing this stuff. Which with noise, you don't necessarily have to be.
Right.
You can go, and this is not saying that one is less than the other. It's more of just a statement of the kind of if you get they're both working on very different logics of music. I think there's structure and there's form and there's mastery in both. But I think the future of improvised music, I will say this, is that I think that there will be some sort of shift after, well, this is going to sound kind of wrong, but like not the musicians themselves, but a lot of the audience, once the boomer generation kind of goes away, to put it
yeah.
and not railing against them, but it's more of like, once that generation goes away, hopefully the musicians can stick around, but once that goes away, I think that there will be more of a willingness to genuinely, for more musicians to kind of try to push things forward at the rate that things were being pushed forward yearly in, let's say, the 80s or even the 90s.
Yeah.
Because right now, in a lot of scenes, I'm not going to name the cities, that a lot of the musicians are kind of in this hyperloop of appealing to older audiences, and it kind of gives them a nostalgia of when they bought their first Albert Eiler record. First Albert Eiler record back in the day.
Right.
So I think that there will be a shift, but it's going to take a while. Obviously, and this is only purely from an American context,
Mm-hmm.
because over in Europe, as you know, it's just constantly expanding and innovating every single day.
Mm-hmm.
But I understand why the American side of this is still stuck in this loop for a lot of these players, is because, the whole improvised music thing is definitively American-born
Right.
thing. Because it comes from the most American form of music, which is, I'm not going to call it the J word, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But that makes sense to an extent. And while with Europe, it's more disconnected from those roots, really. So there is more of a willingness to kind of break away from tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But don't get the wrong idea. There are plenty of insanely innovative and phenomenal musicians that are from the 60s that are still playing. And there's obviously a lot of newer people that are really great.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the future of it's hard to tell, but I think that at a certain point there will be a shift. Now, am I saying it's going to be... I was more talking about musically, not necessarily audience.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that your average, whatever, Gen Alpha kid in 15 years from now is going to be bumping a Barry Guy solo bass record like they would, like a Machine Girl track or whatever the fuck. That. So I think that just historically this is not a youthful music. It's like what Derek Bailey said.
Mm-hmm.
This is very much an old music.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the people that are playing it, as he said, are like over 50 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just how it is. And I have to deal with it. Is it tough? Is it alienating to deal with? That it's very much something that I probably shouldn't be a part of at this age? Yes, but I don't really have any other choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's very well put. I think and also I think also maybe the age thing is because maybe it's just so, like you said, steeped in sort of real knowledge of the form, and it takes years to kind of hone that skill or those skills, and by the time you kind of do, you're much older. And it's just, I don't know. Yeah, I think what you said though that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I mean, do you have anything else you want to add, and then I'll stop recording? But yeah,
that's kind of really my final point.
Okay.
That was really it. It was like it's tough and it's hard to be part of. At this age, but I have no other choice.
Mm-hmm.
I'm too deep into it now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. All right. Let me stop recording.